Lastly, I want to discuss James Fodor's case against the resurrection of Jesus, which he details in his book, Unreasonable Faith. Now, in that book, Fodor is laser focused upon William Lane Craig's case for the resurrection of Jesus. While Craig's case is not as minimal as, say, Gary Habermas's or Mike Lacona's, I think it is fair to say that he still very much falls into the minimalist camp. Again, I recognize that Craig rejects being labeled as a minimalist, but as shown earlier, his resurrection argument falls within the boundaries which I have stipulated for a minimalist approach. And as I explained before, I reject a minimalist approach to defending the resurrection. As such, Fodor's objections are not specifically directed against the sort of resurrection argument which I am offering. With that being said, I still think it will be of value to survey his objections. This is because Fodor's contribution to this debate is somewhat unique, and by showing how the maximalist can overcome Fodor's objections, I will further cement the strength of the maximalist case for the resurrection. William Lane Craig's resurrection argument is based upon four allegedly widely accepted historical facts. These are 1. The burial of Jesus, 2. The empty tomb, 3. The post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and 4. The disciples' belief in the resurrection. Craig argues that the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation of these four facts. Fodor's response grants Craig all of these four facts, but argues that the resurrection is not the best explanation of them. As he explains, I wish to pursue quite a different strategy, one that I believe has been largely neglected in the discourse thus far. Specifically, subject to only a few relatively minor qualifications, I will accept both of the first two premises of Craig's argument. I believe Craig has provided adequate evidence to attest to the four historical facts, even if I believe he does overstate his case at times. I also largely accept the criteria that he presents for judging explanations. Instead, I want to focus my attention on Craig's third premise, that the resurrection hypothesis is the best explanation for the four historical facts. I will present an alternate explanation for Craig's historical facts, defend it against various objections, and then argue that this alternate explanation better fulfills the criteria for a good explanation than does Craig's resurrection hypothesis. As such, I argue that Craig fails to show that the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation for the historical facts, and therefore, his argument for the truth of Christianity fails. Fodor's alternative hypothesis is a combination of four different theses which, according to him, better explain Craig's four facts than the resurrection when assessed by the criteria of a best explanation. He calls it the RHBS hypothesis, as he summarizes. I have termed this explanatory hypothesis the RHBS model, which stands for reburial, hallucination, biases, and socialization, corresponding to the key elements of the model. A summary of the model follows. Reburial. Between Jesus' burial on Friday afternoon and the discovery of the empty tomb on Sunday morning, Jesus' body was removed from the tomb and subsequently reburied. Exactly why is a secondary matter, but in my view, the most likely explanation is that Joseph of Arimathea himself wished to remove Jesus' corpse from his family tomb. Individual hallucinations. Following the discovery of the empty tomb, and exacerbated by grief and emotional excitement, one or more of Jesus' followers experienced individual hallucinations of the risen Jesus. The most likely candidates are Mary and Peter, though that is not essential to the argument. Group religious experiences. These followers then discussed their experiences with the disciples, generating an expectation that they might experience something similar. Partly as a result of this expectancy, and also mediated by social reinforcement, strong emotions, sensory distortions, and environmental influences, the early disciples had several collective religious experiences of the risen Jesus. These experiences were social in nature, and so not purely psychological hallucinations, but were delusory in the sense that they did not involve the disciples actually seeing a physically resurrected Jesus. Memory and cognitive biases. In the process of discussing these experiences among themselves afterwards, the disciples' memories of what they experienced were reshaped through processes of reconstructive recall and social memory cogitation in the direction of increased coherence between individual accounts and also greater impressiveness of the experiences. In the process, a standard version of these experiences began to develop. Cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias, selective perception, and other similar biases combined to reduce any inconsistencies or discrepancies in the accounts or memories. Socialization and marginalization of doubt. Public expressions of doubt, disagreement, and skepticism were further muted because few disbelievers cared enough about Christianity to engage much with early Christians or disprove their claims, and most of those exposed to these claims had neither the inclination nor the ability to check for themselves. Fodor goes on to examine how his RHBS hypothesis compares to Graieg's with respect to satisfying the criteria of a best explanation. He begins by considering the relative parsimony of his hypothesis versus Graieg's. He identifies a more plausible explanation as one with fewer new assumptions and better justified new assumptions. He identifies the new assumptions of the RHBS hypothesis as follows. 1. Jesus' body was removed from the tomb before its discovery by Jesus' women followers. 2. Some of Jesus' followers experienced individual hallucinations of Jesus appearing to them. 3. Reports of the empty tomb in these first appearances triggered a series of collective experiences of the risen Jesus among the disciples. 4. The memories and understanding of these experiences were reshaped over time by psychological and sociological forces towards being more consistent and impressive. Fodor goes on at considerable length, arguing that none of these new assumptions are terribly implausible, since he thinks that he can tell a plausible story to support the first, and that there is considerable psychological evidence to support the plausibility of the other three. Furthermore, he contends that, collectively, these new assumptions possess the explanatory power to adequately account for all of Graieg's 4 facts. This makes it a real competitor against the resurrection hypothesis. As he concludes, overall, therefore, I conclude that each of the 4 postulates of the RHBS model is plausible, and that taken together, they have adequate explanatory scope and moderately high explanatory power in accounting for Graieg's 4 historical facts. As such, I think that the RHBS model provides a reasonably good explanation for the historical facts. It is certainly not a perfect explanation, it does not account for every detail, nor does it do so with maximal degrees of plausibility or explanatory power. Nevertheless, I think it accounts for the facts in question in as good a manner as can reasonably be expected given the paucity of the evidence for such an ancient event. Fodor then moves to assess the relative plausibility and explanatory power of the resurrection hypothesis as Graieg defends it. He concludes that the new assumptions which it includes, namely that God exists, that God would want to raise Jesus from the dead, and that Jesus would want to be seen after his resurrection, are not independently plausible. Fodor is willing to grant that the resurrection hypothesis has strong explanatory power with respect to most of the facts, although he does quibble with its ability to explain the fourth. That is about as brief a summary of Fodor's case as I can give without glossing over essential details. And I actually think that it's a reasonably good response to Graieg's resurrection argument and to minimalist arguments more generally. The key problem with minimalist arguments, which Fodor effectively leverages, is that they do not make any reference to the details of the resurrection appearances in the Gospels. Without those details, it's impossible to make a determination with respect to the question of whether or not the disciples were rational in their belief in the resurrection of Jesus. One can argue all they like for the mere fact that the disciples genuinely believed in the resurrection, but if they did not believe it for good reasons, then this fact is not significant. The whole idea behind an argument based on historical testimony is that the justification which people in the past had for their beliefs is, to some extent, supposed to be able to be transmitted to us in the present. And the justification which those people had was the details of their own experiences. Therefore, our being able to access some of the details of those experiences is absolutely essential to our being able to have justified beliefs about the past. But Graieg's four facts, which make up the premises of his resurrection argument, make no use of the details within the resurrection accounts. Graieg attempts to argue for the resurrection just from the fact that the disciples saw Jesus in some sense, and then came to believe that he was resurrected. This is the critical oversight in minimalist arguments for the resurrection, and Fodor exploits it very well. As he puts it, I should note, however, that accepting these four facts does not amount to accepting the historicity of every detail recorded in the New Testament or in the Gospels specifically. In particular, I do not necessarily grant the historicity of all the details surrounding Jesus' death, burial, and appearances, nor that each appearance recorded in one of the Gospels is necessarily historical. I grant that experiences of the risen Jesus occurred, and that they took place on multiple occasions in different circumstances with individuals and groups of people. This does not, however, entail that all details of such accounts in the Gospels are completely accurate or can be uncritically appealed to. Fortunately, we do not have to rely on minimalist arguments for the resurrection. The maximalist argument, which I have made, explicitly utilizes those details by referencing the credibility of the testimony pertaining to the resurrection of Jesus. Again, the maximalist is not necessarily appealing to the historicity of the details within the resurrection narratives. Rather, the maximalist is appealing to the idea that these details are part of what the original eyewitnesses claim to have seen. Fodor's case against the resurrection depends critically upon the details in the Gospels pertaining to the resurrection appearances not being anything like what the disciples originally experienced. In this way, Fodor drives a wedge between the disciples' belief in the resurrection and the rationality of that belief. The failure of minimalist arguments is that they allow skeptics like Fodor to make this move. The maximalist case, however, is equipped with the resources necessary to block this move. My argument for the resurrection takes for granted something which I extensively defended in a prior video, namely the traditional authorship of the four Gospels. In order to get to the conclusion that the resurrection narratives in the Gospels are nothing like what the disciples originally experienced, one might think that Fodor would have to deny the traditional authorship of the Gospels. After all, it doesn't seem likely that Matthew and John, for example, could be mistaken about their own experiences when they relayed them in their respective Gospels. But Fodor is actually willing to grant traditional authorship, and yet he maintains that this is not sufficient to guarantee that the details in the Gospels accurately relay what the appearances of Jesus were like. As he explains, the embellishments that occurred to the story, therefore, were not primarily gradual legendary accretions, but largely were the result of the psychological and sociological processes I have just outlined, shaping and reshaping the disciples' memories and understandings of what they themselves had experienced. As such, the RHBS model that I am here defending is in no way dependent upon gradual legendary accretion or on the Gospels not having access to original eyewitness testimony. Although I regard it as unlikely that any of the Gospels were directly written by eyewitnesses, nevertheless, my account is consistent with this possibility, since the RHBS model seeks to explain how the eyewitnesses themselves came to believe that the risen Jesus appeared to them in the flesh. The key in achieving this remarkable conclusion for Fodor is his suggestion that the disciples' memories of what had originally occurred in their visionary or hallucinatory experiences were distorted by sociological factors to the extent that they really came to believe that their experiences occurred in the way that they are reported in the Gospels. As he explains, the final postulate of the RHBS model is that the stories of Jesus' appearances that came to be told by Jesus' followers do not correspond exactly to what the disciples really experienced in their collective religious experiences of the risen Jesus, even though the disciples really did believe they were truthfully reporting their experiences. This is the result of the disciples' memories of what they experienced being altered over time, leading to a general increase in impressiveness of the accounts, incorporating new elements from the recollections of other different disciples, and also to enhance the overall coherence of the accounts of different disciples. The weight that Fodor's case will carry against the maximalist argument for the resurrection, then, is directly proportionate to the strength of his evidence that this level of memory distortion really occurred. But before addressing Fodor's case for memory distortion, I just need to flag one thing about his appeal to hallucinations. For although he appeals to memory distortion to explain away the details of the Gospels, Fodor thinks that the disciples' belief in the resurrection was originally generated by hallucinatory experiences. As a result, it is worth asking how likely it is that hallucinations would lead the disciples to believe in the resurrection in the first place, even if the details in the Gospels could be explained by recourse to memory distortion. The basic worry here is that although bereavement hallucinations are somewhat common, they do not typically lead those who have them to believe that the deceased has returned to life. More commonly, they are just interpreted as communications from the deceased from beyond the grave. As David Graieg observes, Fodor then turns to bereavement hallucinations, which are more relevant to the question of Jesus' resurrection. One crucial question that Fodor does not consider is, if hallucinations are common, why are such experiences not regularly understood as resurrections? Fodor then cites studies on individuals involved in new religious movements, indicating that such people are more prone to fantasize. While I can agree with Fodor that hallucinations are relatively commonplace realities, they are consistently interpreted by reasonable people to be, at most, communications of comfort about the departed from beyond the grave, which is to say, even if the disciples had experienced hallucinations, it is improbable, given their first century memory schematics of the afterlife, that they would have remembered this as a resurrection. Instead, it is more probable that the disciples would have interpreted this as evidence that Jesus was dead and destined to arise at the end of the age or assumed into heaven. If bereavement hallucinations are not a good explanation for the disciples' belief in the resurrection in the first place, then Fodor's hypothesis has plausibility difficulties right from the start, even aside from the viability of his claims about the likelihood of memory distortion. But let us put this point aside. Even granting Fodor that bereavement hallucinations could account for the disciples' initial belief in the resurrection, I argue that memory distortion is not a good explanation for how those hallucinatory experiences got transmuted into the reports we find in the Gospels. Now, a preliminary point to make in response to any objection to the historicity of the details within the Gospels on the basis of potential distortions of memory is that one must always be very careful about arguing against the reliability of memory. For one thing, it becomes far too easy to reject almost any historical event one likes on the basis of the possibility of memory distortion. As Angus Menuge puts it, if the possibility of unreliable memory is a reason to reject the reliably preserved, multiply attested reports of eyewitnesses to the resurrection, that would mean that we ought to reject vast amounts of history. Even more seriously, arguments against the reliability of memory are prone to having much more wide-ranging skeptical consequences than is typically appreciated. Furthermore, such arguments are prone to being self-defeating. The reason for this is quite simply that the vast majority of our knowledge is based, at some level, on memory. This is obviously true when it comes to our historical beliefs, but it is also true of our scientific beliefs, which depend on the trustworthiness of the memories of the scientists who perform the experiments which justify scientific beliefs. It is even true of our everyday beliefs, for we rely upon memory to justifiably believe that we did perform such and such an action last week, yesterday, or even 5 minutes ago. In fact, any belief about some event which we are not directly perceiving in the present will depend upon memory. Hence, casting widespread doubt upon the reliability of memory will have disastrous epistemic consequences for almost all of our beliefs. And such skepticism is likely to end up being self-defeating because, inevitably, whatever studies one wishes to cite in support of the thesis that memory is unreliable will have depended upon memory in various ways in order to acquire the evidence that memory is unreliable. The point here is not to ignore the evidence which Fodor cites in support of the idea that memory can sometimes be unreliable. Rather, the point is to caution against being too quick to jump to the conclusion that unreliable memories are very common without being careful to specify the conditions under which they occur and can be identified. For otherwise, one risks the argument being generalized to invalidate nearly everything which we believe. The upshot here is that if we wish to avoid making it far too easy for people to reject absolutely any historical event that they please, or, more seriously, if we wish to avoid global skepticism about the past, we should have a high degree of credence in the general reliability of memory. We should be slow to adopt the unreliability of memory as a basis for rejecting the historicity of a reported event, unless we have very good reasons for doing so in that particular instance. In other words, we should want far more than just general indicators that memory is sometimes unreliable or susceptible to distortion. We should want reasons for thinking that memory distortion is actually at play in a particular case. With all that being said, what are we to make of the evidence Fodor cites in support of the thesis that false memories can occur rather easily. Fodor gives us 5 examples which are supposed to render credible the thesis that what we have in the Gospels are sincere but misremembered recollections of hallucinations. I should highlight from the start that none of his examples of memory distortion or of false memories are particularly similar to what he is proposing. That is to say, none of them involve memory distortion of hallucinations at all. Indeed, it's somewhat difficult to assess the relevance of any of Fodor's examples, since Fodor leaves it quite vague to what extent he believes that the content within the Gospels results from hallucinations, and to what extent it involves memory distortion. As David Graieg points out, while there is some good humility in Fodor stating that the details of precisely what occurred can never be known, and that his model does not pretend to explain exactly how these collective experiences occurred, this is also a weakness of his view, as it is too broad to move from mere possibility to plausibility. Most of all, as explained above, it would be inconsistent with the disciples' worldview and expectations to conclude that Jesus had risen, as the historical texts record. Consequently, Fodor's view lacks explanatory power. According to all of the accounts, the appearances of Jesus began 3 days after the crucifixion and then ended abruptly around 40 days later. Is it Fodor's belief that the group hallucinations actually began precisely at this time and then sharply ended 40 days later? Or is this idea to be attributed to memory distortion? It's really impossible to say because Fodor doesn't tell us. It is difficult to take seriously the suggestion that the disciples really had collective hallucinations only for this precise time frame. As Timothy and Lydia McGrew observe, these detailed parallel integrated hallucinations must be invoked repeatedly across a period of more than a month, during which the disciples were persuaded that they repeatedly interacted with their Lord and Master here on earth, and then, abruptly, they stopped. Christ no longer appeared on earth. From the standpoint of calculating a Bayes factor, the problem with the hallucination theory is that it has a vanishingly small probability. Given that this is radically implausible, I presume that Fodor would opt for the idea that the appearances lasting precisely 40 days owes to memory distortion. But what this implies is that, for Fodor, memory distortion, rather than hallucination, is really doing the heavy lifting in explaining the content of the resurrection narratives in the Gospels. So from this, it follows that the examples of false memories which he cites need to demonstrate this level of memory distortion if they are to make his thesis plausible. In this next section, I shall argue that his examples do not do this. Fodor's first example comes from a 2006 paper by Chrissy Wilson and Christopher French, and it regards a questionnaire in which participants were asked to recall memories about dramatic news footage of 5 different events. 4 of the events were actually documented with video footage, whereas one of them, the bombing of a nightclub in Bali, was not. And yet 36% of participants reported false memories about seeing footage of this bombing. While this example does demonstrate the fairly uncontroversial thesis that humans sometimes form false memories, it's not clear why it does much of anything to support Fodor's thesis that the resurrection appearances of Jesus, as described in the Gospels, can be understood as distorted memories. In the first place, it's relatively easy to see why participants might claim to remember footage of the Bali bombing. It was suggested by the questionnaire itself. For all we know, the participants were genuinely remembering footage of a bombing on TV, and they simply carelessly connected it to the Bali bombing when this was suggested by the questionnaire. Furthermore, there had actually been bombings in Bali just 4 years earlier, which were probably doing some work in generating false memories. Given that participants were being asked about several different dramatic events as they were seen on television, it's fairly easy to see how some confusion might arise. In addition, we don't really know much about how deeply the participants were affected by these news stories. While such stories can surely impact people, there is almost inevitably a greater level of detachment when one sees something on television than when one experiences it for oneself. As David Pillemer points out, similarities and differences between direct and indirect exposure to a shocking occurrence have yet to be studied fully. Comparisons of experienced and reported events suggest that memories of these two types of occurrences do in fact differ in some respects. For example, flashbulb memories of how one heard the news of a public tragedy appear to be factually less consistent over time than memories of tragedies experienced personally. People who directly experienced the 1989 California earthquake had highly consistent memories of this event a year and a half later, whereas people who only heard the news of the earthquake showed more evidence of memory distortion or loss. By contrast, the resurrection accounts in the Gospels are not the results of the prompts of a questionnaire, but rather flow from the conviction of the evangelists. As such, they are not open to the power of suggestion in the same way in which random participants who answer a questionnaire might be. The Gospel accounts are not describing a series of events as seen on television, but rather are recounting the experiences which changed their authors' lives. As such, this first example does show that people can make mistakes and form false memories, especially when the power of suggestion is present, when relaying their memories about several similar events, or when reporting what they have learned indirectly through mediums such as television. But this doesn't do much to render plausible the idea that this is what was going on in the case of the resurrection narratives in the Gospels. As Robert McIver observes, while the DRM false memory procedure might be interesting in its own right, and while the ability to induce false memories by social contagion is fascinating, it might fairly be asked, what do these and other experimental procedures described have to do with the study of the nature of the gospel traditions? What have doctored photos, misleading questions, and memorizing lists of words, and all other diverse ways that have been shown to generate false memories, have in common? The answer is that they are all able to induce false memories because they share the same characteristic of plausibility. The memory frailties of transience, suggestibility, and hindsight bias investigated in earlier chapters were discovered to have more impact on the details of memories rather than on the general gist of what is remembered. If this is true of eyewitness testimony in general, it is therefore true of the contributions that the individual eyewitnesses would have made to the formation of the traditions found in the Synoptic Gospels. Their memories would have been accurate more often than not. They would have been most reliable in reporting the gist of the event and what happened, and least reliable about matters relating to time. Their contribution would have had a first-order faithfulness to the events in Jesus' life that they had witnessed. Fodor's second example involves an experiment discussed in a 2004 paper by Carrie Pickle, where test subjects viewed a videotaped robbery and then were interviewed about it a week later. The experiment showed that some witnesses reported certain details not present within the video. Once again, the relevance of this case to Fodor's thesis seems minimal. Unfortunately, the research he cites within the book doesn't tell us what percentage of the witnesses added false details. Was it a sizable number of witnesses, or was it just a handful? The section cited by Fodor doesn't say what sorts of details were added. Were these added details incidental, or were they added details on the level of Thomas demanding to touch Jesus' wounds, as Fodor's thesis would require? And the paper explicitly leaves open the possibility that the witnesses who did add these details not present in the video were simply lying. This is a possibility that is not open to Fodor, given that he has granted the sincerity of the disciples. In short, it's simply unclear how much memory experiments in a laboratory setting can tell us about human memory of real-life experiences. As Andrew Loke and Nick Meader observe, many of the studies cited in favor of a skeptical view are conducted in the laboratory. For example, the simple idea that memory decays with time is sometimes put forward without acknowledgement that most studies involved meaningless experimental materials and that there are numerous counterexamples. Distortion and deterioration begins within a very short time after the event. Yet in memory of real-world events of greater importance to individuals, initial decay in the total amount recalled typically plateaus, resulting in stable and largely accurate long-term recall of the remainder. Similarly, laboratory experiments designed to manipulate memory or implant false memories may be misleading. The fact that memory can be manipulated in the laboratory is important, but does not by itself allow of any conclusion about how reliable memory is under normal, real-life circumstances. And in any case, recent studies have shown that the way in which participants in these sorts of experiments are asked questions affects the perceived accuracy of their answers. In general, where there is greater opportunity for participants to clarify and add nuance, the level of accuracy increases, casting doubt on the significance of these findings. As John Wixt and his co-authors explain, laboratory studies typically have participants view a mock crime, after which different interviewing strategies are compared, e.g., the cognitive interview versus a standard police interview protocol. Although most studies are concerned with the ability of a structured interview, such as the cognitive interview, to elicit more information than alternative techniques, many studies also report the accuracy of the obtained information. In an early meta-analysis of the literature, it was determined that the cognitive interview elicited significantly more information than alternative interviews. More importantly for our present purposes, they also found that accuracy was as high or slightly higher in the cognitive interviews than in the comparison interviews. Comparable accuracy scores were recently reported by Rivard, Fisher, Robertson, and Hearn-Mueller in a more realistic study. Critically, of the recalled information that could be corroborated, the accuracy rates were 88% correct and 87% correct for the cognitive interview and a standard interview protocol, respectively. Accuracy rates that fall in the range of 85% to 90% correct indicate that eyewitness recall for details is not perfect, but such results are hard to reconcile with the prevailing notion that eyewitness memory is simply unreliable. Another factor overlooked by Fodor and the individuals he is citing is that oftentimes the surveys of these individuals do not allow participants to give an indeterminate answer. Participants are sometimes forced to answer yes or no to the questions, which effectively makes them guess, and so is insensitive to the fact that memory may not even be in play at times. Yet if the participants guess incorrectly, then this is taken to be a strike against the reliability of their memory. Obviously, this skews the final results of many studies on memory, giving an unfairly negative perception of the reliability of memory. Again, Wixt and his co-authors suggest, witness confidence may be assessed unobtrusively by allowing witnesses to withhold uncertain responses or to say, "I don't know." Presumably, if given the opportunity to withhold a response, witnesses will withhold the low confidence responses. In a test of this hypothesis, Evans and Fisher showed experimental witnesses a brief crime video and then tested them with either free recall, cued recall, or yes and no questions. Moreover, witnesses were either permitted to withhold responses, say, "I don't know," or they were forced to answer all questions. As might be expected, witnesses were less confident about responses they withheld, and were later asked to report, than responses they provided voluntarily. In agreement with the results summarized in Figures 3 and 4, witnesses were very accurate for the high confident answers they provided voluntarily, but accuracy declined considerably when they were forced to also provide low confidence responses. Fodor's third example draws from a 1994 paper by Roger Buehler and Dale Griffin, which showed that an individual's interpretation of an event can shift after they either conform to or dissent from the viewpoint of a group. I confess that this seems rather unremarkable to me. I don't really need a scientific study to tell me that one's affiliation with a particular group can color how they see the world, since common experience bears this out. Fodor neglects to explain how this is supposed to support his thesis. I suppose the idea is that once a group of Christians was established, the group perspective colored the way in which the disciples viewed their hallucinatory experiences, thereby giving us the gospel narratives. But this, then, seems to assume that these experiences of the risen Jesus, as they are reported, were not the basis for Christianity in the first place. This again raises the question of how belief in the resurrection originated. And in any case, the types of examples canvassed in Buehler and Griffin's paper don't really encompass flashbulb memories or personal event memories, which are the two most likely classes of memories under which the resurrection appearances of Jesus would have been formed. And there is good evidence that these sorts of memories are less susceptible to the sorts of distortion that Fodor is bringing up here. More on this in a moment. Fodor's fourth example comes from a 2002 paper by Agnieszka Niedzwiecka, though he accidentally cites it as a 2012 paper, and it regards an experiment wherein students were asked to recall two significant autobiographical events, then were shown a videotape of a young woman recounting her own experiences of those events. After this, they were asked to recall those autobiographical events again, and it was found that most of the students ended up incorporating elements from the young woman's account into their second account. Yet again, I really struggle to see the relevance of this experiment to Fodor's thesis. Obviously, if one has recently heard someone else recounting an event which they lived through, then they are more likely to incorporate some of those elements within their own account. This is especially so if the other person has mentioned an aspect which the original witness saw but neglected to mention, or if that aspect is consistent with their own experience. It's really not even clear that this is a case of memory distortion. It seems to be more akin to the results of DRM experiments, showing that similar ideas tend to be remembered alongside others simply because of the close association between the concepts. As McIver puts it, Rodinger and McDermott discovered that if experimental participants were asked to recall the following list of words: bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, wake, snooze, blanket, doze, slumber, snore, nap, peace, yawn, drowsy, that the word sleep would be remembered as frequently as any of the words in the middle of the list. This should not be surprising, given that the word sleep has strong associations with all the other words in the list. One must note what kind of an error it is to include sleep in a list comprised of bed, rest, dream, etc. It is true that sleep is not a part of the list, but it is consistent with the list. One could question whether sleep is a false memory or just memory working in its usual way, as it endeavors to bring out the underlying meaning of experiences. But even if Fodor's example does present us with a case of genuine memory distortion, it involves melding similar memories together. Fodor has got to explain how the entire story of Thomas touching Jesus' wounds, for example, developed as the result of memory distortion, when this wasn't anything like anyone's actual hallucinatory experience. And it seems pretty clear that this example does little to further this goal. Fodor's final example is a study which revealed that witnesses tend to modify their description of suspects based upon their audience's evaluation of the suspect. But again, I really fail to see how this relatively common sense observation is supposed to support the idea that memory distortion can account for the resurrection narratives representing honest but misremembered descriptions of hallucinations. As Graieg concludes, Fodor lists an article arguing that flashbulb memories only have perceived accuracy based on North Carolina students' memories of an event in other states. However, he does not engage studies that found that the greater the connection that one has to an event, the more likely one is to form an accurate flashbulb memory. Admittedly, Fodor does proceed to cite studies indicating that false memories are not limited to disinterested individuals. These results do not actually support Fodor's argument because in the cases Fodor references, it is not that the individuals misremembered that the event took place, but that they misremember who did it. Further, Fodor mentions the cases of identifying a rape victim, one of which was sadly misremembered, as an individual who was seen on television during the terrible violation, and, consequently, it is not clear that such cases are analogous. So far, I have objected to Fodor's thesis on the grounds that we should be very reluctant to appeal to the fallibility of memory to explain away testimonial evidence on pain of global skepticism about memory. As a result of this, we should have case-specific evidence for memory distortion before being too enthusiastic about settling on memory distortion as a significant explanation for how some testimony came to be. And I have further objected that the specific examples he cites of memory distortion don't seem particularly analogous to what he is proposing for the descriptions of the resurrected Jesus in the Gospels. But we should also consider the positive case for the general reliability of memory and the reliability of memories of significant moments in particular. It will be instructive to consider Robert McIver's excellent work on memory here, since he directly connects it to the testimony contained within the Gospels. After surveying much of the contemporary psychological literature, McIver finds that memory regularly deteriorates by up to 20% within the first 5 years of an event having happened. If the event is remembered at all after this time, McIver's findings suggest that memory is stable after this point for at least 20 years. As he says, each of the experiments on human memory reported so far has underlined the fact that human memories are indeed transient. Moreover, most reveal that the macro effects of this transience are largely predictable. But of the different kinds of memory that have been shown to exhibit a similar pattern of retention and loss, episodic memory that survives for the first 5 years after an event is likely to be very stable for the next 20 years or more, after which time a further slow decline takes place. It may even be estimated that between 30 and 50% of significant material is likely to survive long enough to become a near permanent part of long-term memory. McIver's findings are not only supported by the psychological data which he examines, but they also more or less comport with common sense. We don't need to perform exotic experiments to know that we have a harder time remembering things as time goes on up until a certain point. The upshot here is simply that human memory, while certainly not infallible, is generally fairly reliable. It deteriorates more quickly within the first 5 years after an event, but even here it tends to remain up to 80% accurate, and after 5 years, memory tends to remain stable for another 20. As David Pillemer puts it, despite these qualifications, research supports a conclusion that fits nicely with commonly held conceptions of human memory. Memories of personal life episodes are generally true to the original experiences, although specific details may be omitted or misremembered, and substantial distortions occasionally do occur. Fodor is right to remind us of the distortions to which memory is subject, but the preponderance of data suggests that this is not what is typically going on, and when memory is distorted, the distortions tend to turn up in details like the time at which an event occurred, the color of people's clothing, or the interpretation of someone's underlying motives. But clearly these sorts of minor errors of memory are not anything like what Fodor is proposing. Fodor needs memories of hallucinations to be transmuted into the sorts of descriptions we find of the risen Jesus in the Gospels. And neither these common sorts of memory distortions, nor even some of the more extreme cases documented by Fodor, illustrate that this level of memory distortion is possible, let alone that it is common. As David Pillemer concludes, it is safe to say that memory researchers do approach a consensus on some issues. There is widespread agreement that memory is an active, reconstructive process rather than a passive reproductive process. In the process of constructing a memory narrative, errors can occur. At the same time, memory, for the most part, does its job. That is, memory descriptions usually are consistent with the general form and content of past experiences, even if particular details are lost, added, or distorted in the act of remembering. A person hit by a car may misremember its color or the day of the week, but will rarely confuse being hit by a car with, say, falling down a mountain. Andrew Loke and Meader add, since the mid-2010s, we have seen another revision of the consensus on reliability of memory. For example, Baddeley questions whether the focus on the sins of memory has led researchers to downplay the virtues of memory. Recent studies give support to this suggestion. And elsewhere, Meader says, an influential study published a few years ago kick-started a replication crisis in psychology. Researchers were only able to replicate the findings of a third to half of all studies they investigated. This started a period of reflection across the discipline. There is growing evidence of an unrealistically negative view on the accuracy of memory. But perhaps more significantly, there is compelling evidence that specific types of memories are more reliable than general memories. In particular, there has been a lot of discussion surrounding what psychologists have labeled flashbulb memories and personal event memories. These are particularly vivid memories of short but significant events. As David Pillemer says, flashbulb memory has come to be associated primarily with memories of learning about newsworthy events. Presumably the disciples considered Jesus' resurrection to be newsworthy, since it would come to form the heart of the gospel. The Greek word for gospel is evangelion, and it literally translates to good news. Flashbulb memories are likelier to form when an event is especially important to someone. McIver gives the following example. The reported study included 40 white students and 40 black students. It was discovered that the black students were much more likely to form a flashbulb memory of the death of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King than the white students. Brown and Kulik concluded that this is evidence that personal consequentiality is important in the formation of flashbulb memories. As a result of their analysis, Brown and Kulik postulated that a flashbulb memory is fixed for a very long time and conceivably permanent, varying in complexity with consequentiality, but once created, always there and in need of no further strengthening. This memory, they suggested, is not preserved in a narrative or verbal form, but in other forms, such as images. Robert McIver argues that the evidence is strong that these sorts of memories are uniquely resilient against the sort of memory distortion which Fodor's hypothesis requires. He finds that more recent research has corroborated the idea that personal event memories display a higher level of immunity to distortion than typical memories. A particularly striking example here regards a comparison between the memories of veterans who actually fought during World War II and the memories of those who did not. The veterans were consistently able to get the details right, such as the weather during particular days, the specific dates of particular invasions, and even the days of the week on which particular battles occurred, far more often than those who were not directly involved. McIver summarizes the results, saying, compared to many other types of memory, flashbulb and other personal event memories are long-lived and have the ability to retain many details with great accuracy. Not all details are remembered, and not with 100% accuracy. What is retained, though, is sufficient to contain the gist of the event. Thus, one is safe in concluding that personal event memories are more long-lived than other types of memory and can be relied on to conserve the general gist of the event, even if some of the details might be lost or even wrong. It seems likely that whether hallucinatory or not, the disciples' experiences of the risen Jesus would have formed flashbulb memories, or, at the very least, personal event memories, given their personal connection to Jesus and the obvious significance which these experiences had on them. But since these types of memories appear to be particularly resistant to being distorted, Fodor's hypothesis is a particularly implausible explanation for them. As Loke and Meader suggest, several studies have shown that events of personal or emotional significance are recalled far more accurately, and it has been argued in recent literature that the earliest Christians' remembrance of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances belongs to this category, as such events would have been regarded to be of foundational importance for the earliest Christian movement. And McIver adds, much of the episodic memories of the eyewitnesses of Jesus would have been of such a nature as to form personal event memories. What has been discovered about personal event memories allows at least 3 more observations about the contribution that the memories of the eyewitnesses may have made to the formation of the gospel traditions. First, while their memories are often likely to be accurate in the details recounted, they would have been most reliable at the level of gist. Second, eyewitness memories tend to be concentrated around a moment of time. Personal event memories are characterized by the recollection of emotional reactions and vivid details concentrated in a very short period of time. Eyewitness memory, then, is granular. It remembers short moments in great detail. Of significance is the observation that was made in the previous chapter that the various pericopes that make up the Synoptic Gospels exhibit a similar granularity. Studies on personal event memories do show that humans can accurately remember some details over periods as long as 50 or more years. This lends more credibility to the observation made already. Those eyewitness memories of Jesus' ministry that survived intact for the first 5 or so years would likely have lasted over the lifetime of that eyewitness. In addition to the comparable resistance of personal event memories against the sort of distortion which Fodor is positing, we should also note that specific details within the resurrection narratives themselves are resistant to explanation by recourse to memory distortion. Of particular interest here is the example of doubting Thomas in the Gospel of John. Thomas is said to have demonstrated remarkable skepticism towards the idea that Jesus rose from the dead until he was permitted to touch Jesus' wounds. It's difficult to see how this episode fits within Fodor's hypothesis. If this event is admitted to be part of the apostles' original testimony, then it seems that Fodor could see the appearance to Thomas either as being a hallucination which Thomas experienced, or as a distortion of John's memory. But both alternatives face difficulties. As a skeptic in denial about the resurrection, Thomas does not appear to be in a frame of mind which would have made him susceptible to a bereavement hallucination. Plus, the group setting, accompanied by an invitation by Jesus for Thomas to touch him, further mitigate against the plausibility of this episode having been entirely hallucinatory. As David Graieg puts it, in theory, others might be able to convince someone that Jesus appeared to them. However, this would depend on the individual's personality. For example, in the case of a doubting Thomas, one might require more evidence. Consequently, while such studies on memory might support the notion that some of the 500 came to believe as outlined earlier, it would not, however, support the idea that all experiences of the risen Jesus could have arisen in that way. However, there are also problems with trying to explain the Doubting Thomas episode as a distortion of memory, because the evidence that distortion due to factors such as suggestibility and social contagion indicates that such distortion must at least broadly be consistent with the original memory or event. As Graieg observes, is it plausible that such a statement might have implanted the notion that the tomb was empty and Jesus was raised? Studies on suggestibility show that one is only able to implant information within limits consistent with the context, and so even given resurrection predictions, the first century Jewish beliefs about the afterlife, not to mention someone would have eventually checked for the body, such an extrapolation is not supported by research on memory. Yet there appears to be no way for the episode with Thomas to be consistent with the original memory if this episode is purely or primarily the result of distortion. Either Thomas originally demonstrated skepticism towards the resurrection, or he did not. If he did, then as we have already noted, hallucinations are not a plausible explanation for how he came to believe in it. If he did not demonstrate initial skepticism, then the memory distortion which Fodor is hypothesizing is not a plausible explanation for how this episode came to be written down, since it is no longer even remotely consistent with the original event. Thomas's skepticism makes him resistant to Fodor's explanation for how his belief in the resurrection might have arisen. And for an independent reason, Thomas's skepticism makes him resistant to Fodor's explanation for how this story might have arisen as the result of memory distortion. There is, therefore, a genuine dilemma for Fodor's hypothesis here, if the account about Thomas is an authentic part of what the apostles originally claimed. It is worth highlighting that when he specifically addresses the story of doubting Thomas, Fodor simply rejects its authenticity. He says, "Many scholars have noted the clear apologetic intent of this passage, which, combined with the fact that it is only reported in John, the latest of the Gospels, has led many scholars to doubt its historicity. Furthermore, claims to prior skepticism, as seen in the case of Thomas and elsewhere in the Gospels, are a well-known narrative device used in reporting miraculous or paranormal events. The accounts of doubting Thomas are, therefore, best explained as later apologetic accretions to the core narrative, made, likely unconsciously, in accordance with the common motif of the avowal of prior skepticism concerning miraculous claims." Graieg has not provided evidence to show that Thomas truly was as skeptical as John claims he was, or that the events in this passage occurred exactly as John claims they did. As such, Graieg's appeal to the appearance to Thomas adds no compelling evidence to his case for the resurrection. David Graieg replies to Fodor on this front by saying, "Just because only one source mentions an event does not mean that one should doubt that account. Instead, one source still increases the likelihood of the authenticity of an event, even if multiple independent attestation would further strengthen the case." Fodor also points out that prior claims to skepticism are a common narrative device. However, what Fodor needs to demonstrate is that, in this instance, it is merely a fictional narrative device. Based on the little information known about Thomas, his doubt concerning Jesus' resurrection is consistent with his character, and so it is probably a historically plausible event. Graieg is right to point out that a source should not be rejected simply because it is the only source to mention an event. Other factors pertaining to the general trustworthiness of the source must also be considered. However, in the context of his book, I actually think that Fodor is permitted to reject the appearance to Thomas. This is because that chapter is a direct response to Graieg's argument for the resurrection, and since Graieg does not show that the story of doubting Thomas meets any of his criteria of authenticity, Fodor is well within his rights to disallow Graieg from appealing to it. Things become more complicated, however, when Fodor moves away from this very narrow task and suggests that his RHBS model can be applied more generally, even to more robust resurrection arguments like mine. Recall that Fodor thinks that his RHBS hypothesis can succeed even on the assumption of traditional authorship and on the assumption that the apostles were intending to be honest. Perhaps he means to accommodate these requirements by suggesting that the story of Thomas was likely unconsciously added to the narrative. I really must wonder how exactly Fodor conceives of that happening. It's not as though one can modify a few things within the episode with Thomas to get around the difficulty which it poses for Fodor's hypothesis. The exclusive reason why the story is included at all is to spotlight Thomas's skepticism, so Fodor can't get around this just by saying that a few elements may have been unconsciously added to the narrative. On the contrary, what he is suggesting would require that the entire story has been fabricated for apologetic reasons. But how are we to imagine that such a thing could happen unconsciously? The very suggestion is so implausible on its face that it does not merit serious consideration. While Graieg's methodology allows Fodor to simply reject the story of doubting Thomas, Fodor is not permitted to reject it in the context of my argument for the resurrection, precisely because my argument is predicated upon the premise that the resurrection accounts in the Gospels present an accurate picture of what the original witnesses claim to have seen. Fodor may challenge this premise, of course, but in doing so, he tacitly admits that he cannot, in fact, make the case that the resurrection appearances in the Gospels represent sincere but misremembered recollections of hallucinations, contrary to his claim that his hypothesis can work even granting traditional authorship and the sincerity of the original witnesses. He actually does have to suggest that certain resurrection appearances are either knowingly false or, at the very least, not faithful to what the original eyewitnesses claimed. This is all that I need to establish in order to show that Fodor's RHBS hypothesis does not succeed against my argument for the resurrection. This section has reviewed James Fodor's RHBS hypothesis as a rival to the resurrection hypothesis. I have granted that Fodor's hypothesis presents a reasonably good defeater to minimalist arguments for the resurrection, like William Lane Craig's. However, I have taken issue with Fodor's more ambitious suggestion that his hypothesis can also succeed as a rival against a more maximal case for the resurrection, like mine. Specifically, it struggles to account for the descriptions of the resurrected Jesus in the Gospels if those descriptions are faithful to what the original disciples claim to have seen. Fodor's case here depends critically upon the plausibility of the thesis that these descriptions can be explained as cases of memory distortion. I have argued in response that we should be very slow to accept explanations which depend upon memory distortion due to the radically skeptical consequences to which this sort of reasoning opens the door. I have also argued that Fodor's specific examples of memory distortion are importantly disanalogous to the sort of memory distortion that his hypothesis would require. I have further argued that there is a good positive case for the reliability of memory in general, and for personal event memories in particular. Lastly, I have argued that the story of Doubting Thomas provides a unique hurdle for Fodor's hypothesis as deployed against a maximalist argument for the resurrection. This is because maximalism deliberately closes off the very exits which Fodor uses to escape the conclusion of minimalist arguments. While I consider Fodor's RHBS hypothesis to be the best alternative to the resurrection on offer for skeptics, I believe that the points I have raised are, collectively, sufficient to show that the resurrection remains a better explanation of the total evidence by a fairly significant measure.